Everybody, and welcome to the Family Matters interview series. Thank you so much for choosing to join the presentation, and we are happy to have you here with us. Just a couple reminders that all lines will be muted throughout tonight's presentation. So if you have any questions, you can put it into the chat box, and someone from the BCAT team will respond to you within 2 to 3 business days. All right, tonight we are going to hear from Dr. William Mansbach to discuss what to do when you notice some changes in mood and memory in your loved one, and how you can spot check those areas of concern to decide next steps. Dr. Mansbach is the founder and chief executive officer of Mansbach Health Tools, which supports the BCAT Research Center. He is also the Chief Executive Officer and President of Counterpoint Health Services, a multidisciplinary behavioral health care company specializing in geriatrics and dementia care. For many years, he was the Chief Operating Officer of the largest geriatric behavioral health care company in the U.S., specializing in long-term care. Dr. Mansbach has an international reputation as a researcher, clinician, and consultant in the aging field. He was a pioneer in the development of memory clinics and is the creator of the BCAT and ENRICH systems, which integrate cognitive tests, interventions, and dementia prevention programs. He is the co-author of the award-winning book, Brain Health as You Age, A Practical Guide to Maintenance and Prevention. And Dr. Mansbach's most recent peer-reviewed articles can be found on the BCAT Research Center page. Joining Dr. Mansbach tonight is Abby Williams, the Director of Strategic Integration at Mansbach Health Tools. So without further ado, let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Family Matters. We are so excited having you join us today. For this episode, we're joined by Dr. William Mansbach, the founder and CEO of Mansbach Health Tools, which supports the BCAT Research Center. He is also the Chief Executive Officer and President of Counterpoint Health Services, an interprofessional behavioral healthcare company specializing in geriatrics and dementia care. Welcome, Dr. Mansbach. We are glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Abby. It's great to be with you.
The first question is, can you explain a little bit about your role at Counterpoint Health Services and the Brain Health and Psychiatry Center? And just tell us a little bit about what services they provide.
Sure. Counterpoint is a company that specializes in providing psychiatric, psychological, and memory care services to older adults, their families. We provide this care to older adults in nursing homes and senior living communities like assisted living or memory care or CCRCs, continuing care retirement communities, and that kind of thing. But we also provide care to the larger community, both in person and also through virtual telepsych services. The Brain Health and Psychiatry Center is a little bit separate from all that. It's sort of within the Counterpoint world, but there we specialize in brain health per se. The whole idea is to come to the interprofessional team there, and that consists of someone from neuropsychology, someone from geriatric psychiatry, and the sort of unique concept of a brain health coach. And we try to figure out, well, what's going on now for a person with respect to the cognitive continuum. Do they have MCI, dementia, or are they just a person who wants to protect their brain as they age? And we prescribe not just medications. Hopefully we don't have to prescribe medications, but specific working memory exercises and sort of a total brain health approach. That would be things like looking at sleep and looking at diet and looking at social engagement. So it's a unique concept, but it provides a lot of support to the older adult and to the caregiver.
Great. And I love the interprofessional model. That's great. So we're going to dive right in. This topic is about mood and how it relates to the older adult. Many of our families listening, they may not be familiar with the term mood, and more specifically, they may not realize that mood can mean anxiety. Can you define what mood is and how it impacts daily life for older adults?
Sure, and Abby, it is confusing because mood is both a lay term. We refer to a mood being having a certain mood, but it's also a clinical term when we think about mood functioning. And clinically, we think about it from a mental health or a mental illness even perspective. But mood refers to a collection of emotional states. Primarily, we think about two aspects of that: depression, which I think many people are familiar with, and anxiety. And those terms also are both lay terms and clinical terms. So just to be clear, depression is a collection of symptoms that negatively interfere with everyday life. So it's not just a subjective sense of feeling down, although that could be a part of it, but there are other symptoms as well. Same thing for anxiety. It's not just the day-to-day anxiety that anyone might feel, but when we think about it clinically, it's a persistent anxiety. It's a daily anxiety or nearly daily anxiety that interferes in a negative way with the quality of life. And I suppose you could also include bipolar disorder, since that is a disturbance in mood regulation. Primarily, we think about the mood siblings. That would be depression and anxiety.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks for explaining that.
Sure.
And expanding upon that, when thinking of the term mood, we should also consider assessing the mood of the caregiver, since we know that being a caregiver can be very stressful at times. I know today's discussion is really typically around the older adult, but many middle-aged individuals do become caregivers for their loved ones. How does the mood impact the care for the older adults?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you're bringing that up because mood functioning is something that we all share and it applies to all of us. And any of us in any situation can have a disturbance in mood. It could be just a single episode or it could be a series of episodes. And high risk situations for mood problems like depression and anxiety, if you think about them, being a caregiver is one of them. It's a highly stressful situation. So to understand how it might be different for, let's say, a caregiver as opposed to an older adult or someone else, let's first define what we mean by depression and anxiety, and then we can talk about it in terms of a caregiver. So for depression, there are a number of different symptoms, but if you think about it for just a general family audience, we're really looking at either, and it could be both, a change in mood where a person feels down or blue or distressed in some way, or a person doesn't feel like they have the kind of enthusiasm or excitement for activities that they used to find very pleasurable. You'll often see disturbances in sleep or in appetite. You'll often see social withdrawal, sometimes feelings of guilt, and in a very extreme way, thoughts of self-harm or suicide, which I'm sure we'll get to in a moment. Anxiety is different. I think we all know what anxiety is, but when it interferes in everyday life, it tends to be a sense of feeling overwhelmed, not being able to stop one's thinking about whatever it is that makes us anxious. Anxiety tends to be about something that hasn't happened yet, something that could happen, something in the future in some ways. And that applies to all of us, an older adult and a caregiver. So if we move to the specific issues of a caregiver, if you think about it from a psychological burden standpoint, it's a situation where you could be watching a loved one, if it's a familial or a family caregiver. You can watch someone with dementia decline. I think it's easy to see how that could be overwhelming. It could create a lot of anxiety. How do I take care of this person? But it can also be very depressing in some way. So I think that there's a unique sort of feature. Caregivers who spend a minimum of 2 hours every day or 10 hours a week have a 3x or 3 times probability of developing depressive symptoms than a same age person who's not in a caregiving role. So if if you think about it, it really is a risk factor. And we always say to the caregiver, it's very important that you take care of yourself. And there are ways of doing that. And on this program, perhaps we can talk about some things like 15 for me and things that you can do. And I think we're probably going to also get at Abby, this, how do you know when you might be feeling these things? And we'll get to that as well. It's the same with anxiety. You have to take care of yourself. The risk is almost 3x for that too. Not quite, but almost, about 2.5. So think about caregiving as a very important set of jobs or roles, but one that comes with some risk to mood.
Yeah, that 3 times is a lot. That really increases the, just the overall risk of putting yourself into more of a depressive situation. What symptoms should we be aware of, or should the caregivers of the older adults or the caregivers themselves, or if they're paying attention to their loved one, what symptoms should we be aware of for those elevated anxiety or signs of depression?
So we talk about 5 in particular, and to make it easy, there's a scale that anyone can do. It's a self-assessment. It's called the M5 or the Mood 5. Interestingly, the BCAT Research Center developed the M5 during the COVID-19 pandemic. From March of 2020 moving forward, the team had collected a lot of data on how older adults were doing, how healthcare providers were doing with respect to managing living in a pandemic like COVID-19, a novel virus. And as we were doing it, we were trying to develop a way of measuring all this. So the M5 evolved out of that, peer-reviewed, good science, published. And anyone who's listening can use it. You just go to a website. It's enrichvisits.com, enrichvisits.com. That was one word. And just click on M5 and there you have it. So there are 5 features to the M5, which coincide with the 5 symptoms that you should be looking at. And some of them tap into anxiety, some tap into depression. So there are items like, do you feel blue or down for a certain period of time? And that's kind of quantified, so you can take a look at that. And this is a change in behavior. So if you've always been, sort of feeling blue and down, then that's kind of a different phenomenon. And this question of what we call anhedonia, that's a big sort of technical word. But anhedonia is one of the most significant indicators of depression. And all that really means is that person, as I mentioned once before, sort of loses a sense of enjoyment or pleasure out of activities that used to give one pleasure. So that's important. In terms of anxiety, I think it's feeling overwhelmed, having really difficulty controlling worry in some ways. And then there's sort of a 5th item, which is a kind of a combination, and there's somatic or more bodily functions. And that would be when a person feels like they're getting more headaches, GI distress, back pain, those are 3 in particular, or changes in cognition. And that's an interesting one where a person might feel a little bit more confused. So when you take the M5, it's a 10-point scale. It's very simple to do. If you have 3 or more points, that would indicate that, you might be getting into that territory of feeling either depressed or anxious. And if you get to that 6 and higher, then you probably should have a conversation with someone. Or we say that if you are at a 6 or higher for 90 days, 3 months, you might actually have depression or generalized anxiety.
So you mentioned the ENRICH Visits website. Is the M5, the Mood 5, that's free for everyone, and it's something that the caregiver could take and the older adult, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. What's good for one is good for the other.
Great.
The science is good for both.
Good. You mentioned, as part of describing the Mood 5, how one of the signs can be kind of a disinterest in activities that they normally would enjoy. In terms of the older adults, often the loved ones may experience that the older adult in the family, they lose disinterest in activities that they once enjoyed. So, for example, they no longer want to read the newspaper and they don't want to take a walk, things that they did
Mhm.
every day. Could these changes be related to mood, or could this also be a change in cognition?
So that's a very sophisticated question, I mean, the easy answer, it could be both. I think the hallmark indication of possible depression in an older adult is anhedonia, this idea of losing interest in things. And that, by the way, Abby, is not about this is in the absence of losing the physical ability. I'll give you a simple example. Let's say that someone really loves to sew, but they have advanced osteoarthritis or arthritic condition in some ways, and they can't do it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about somebody who has the ability to do it, but they're no longer interested in it. So that's like the hallmark symptom in an older adult. At the same time, though, sometimes we don't do things that we used to do because we can't do them anymore. And sometimes we don't want people to know, or we don't tell people. And that might be an indicator of something else. A cognitive change, it doesn't necessarily mean dementia, but you begin to think, well, maybe that's about something else, especially when it's combined with a change in memory or a kind of fog in some ways. Now, I say that we are recording this when we're still in sort of a COVID phase, right? So people will be listening to this at different times, of course, and hopefully we'll be at a point where we're totally in an endemic and not in a pandemic. That said, anhedonia can happen in cases of cognitive decline, but it might also be related to depression, and more often that's where we would look. Now, if you're a caregiver of a loved one who already has dementia, you're looking at change. So if things get worse, more anhedonia or other symptoms of depression, that's important. Depression is one of the most successfully treated conditions that we have, more so than dementia, I'm afraid. So it's really important to identify depression for what it is, not pretend that it's not an issue. It really is an issue, highly treatable, as is anxiety, or the anxiety disorder. So that would be important.
So you mentioned, cognition a little bit and memory, and we've talked about mood. So could you please explain the connection between the mood and cognition? How does mood affect the memory concerns? I know you mentioned the fog. How does one impact the other with the older adult?
Yeah, so changes in memory, particularly if they're related to dementia or a pre-dementia syndrome called MCI, mild cognitive impairment, which, by the way, is not necessarily mild. It just means that it hasn't progressed to the level of dementia, the severity of dementia. So the brain is very complicated, right? You have 80 to 100 billion different neurons, and there are different lobes, and there's the cortical area and the subcortical area. There's a lot that's going on in the brain. And generally, when there are changes in cognition, there are also changes in mood. In early stages of dementia and in MCI, some of those changes are related to a person observing, becoming aware that they're having, let's say, memory difficulties. And that can be highly anxiety producing. It could also create feelings of dysphoria or depression in some ways. But there's another way of thinking about it in terms of the neurophysiology of the brain, Abby, and that is the very changes in certain structures of the brain that account for things like the ability to attend and focus, comprehension, memory, also have a role in mood regulation. So some of it is awareness, you're just watching yourself, but some of it is actually at the level of the brain. There are changes that are going on there that affect what's actually happening in terms of a person's mood or perception.
So now that we've talked about the connection, what can families do, that are listening in to help check if their loved ones are experiencing, changes in mood, or if it's memory, or if it's a little of
Yep.
both. So what are those next steps for families?
So I always share with families, you start with assessment, but you can start with self-assessment. And that can tell you if you need, a healthcare provider or professional to get involved. So with respect to mood, do the M5 or the Mood 5. It's the same thing. Also on that same website, which is free for people, is my Mem Check, which I have to say is my favorite cognitive self-assessment because anyone can do it. If you have a loved one who's having some cognitive problems, you can help them. You get a little report. It can be emailed to you. And it's not a diagnostic test. It's just a screening tool, but it will tell you if maybe you need to talk to your doctor or another healthcare professional, something like that. So you have to determine, is this a real thing? Do I need to get somebody else, a professional, involved to kind of broaden the team? That said, though, Abby, the one thing that is non-pharmacologic or non-medication related, the one thing that is best for supporting mood, but also supporting cognition, are what are called working memory exercises. It just so happens that these very specific exercises are based on neuroplasticity, the idea of having neurons reconnected and talking to one another when they get disconnected as we age. A very good science, not hocus pocus, but really clear science. Working memory exercises that have been validated by science are important. So what we found in study after study is that working memory exercises improve cognition, particularly attention and memory, but they also improve mood. And they do that because the neurons, or the parts of the brain that are responsible for both mood and memory and cognition, they share a common stem. So and they're called working memory exercises on this part of the brain. So anyone who's listening could also go on that same website, and they could go to a bookstore, a store there, and they can check out, can read about working memory exercises. Choose any one that you want, that you're comfortable with, but just make sure they're validated by science. There's a lot that's out there that isn't, but it really can make a difference.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. It looks like we only have time for one more question, and you did kind of touch on this, but I want to see if you have any last takeaways for the families and the caregivers too. And how does overall brain health affect mood and cognition? I know you touched on a little bit with the working memory exercises, but anything else that you want to add?
Sure. So just in brief, the brain is highly influenced by our behaviors. And what I mean by that is, in addition to making sure that we move our brain, we move our bodies, and we move toward other people, those three things that we talk a lot about. Diet really matters. Sleep really matters. Social engagement really matters. Diet, we recommend something called the Mind Diet. People can read about that and all these other things in a book called Brain Health as You Age. And Brain Health as You Age is sort of a guide to help people kind of think about, well, how can they protect their brains, as they age. One quick thing about sleep, which is really important, is that we as human beings have a normal sleep-wake cycle, and our brains do certain things while we sleep and certain things when we're awake. What happens particularly in dementia is that the majority of people with dementia are going to have a disruption in sleep-wake. And so what's going to happen then is that people are going to have mood issues and cognitive issues during the day because their brain feels like it's sleep time, and conversely. So there are these circadian rhythms that are really important. So you can read about that, you can think about that. And my final takeaway is, if you suspect that a loved one that you're caring for has depression or anxiety, don't just say, well, that's normal aging, because it's not. It's actually, what's normal is that any of us in the lifespan, across the lifespan, can have periods of depression, periods of anxiety, and so forth. But when it becomes entrenched, that's not normal, and it is treatable, even in dementia. So If your M5 score indicates that you have an elevated mood issue, then I would take it to, bring it to the attention of a healthcare provider that you can trust.
It's great. I hope that the families are taking away that this is not only for their loved ones, but also for their overall brain health as well, and just overall well-being. So I think this topic was great, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit and talk with me.
Happy to be with you and looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. We would also like to take this opportunity to invite you to become a member of the ENRICH Brain Health Program if you're not already, by signing up on our website, which is enrichvisits.com. And if you're interested, you can also follow us on our social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And these are our handles. And again, if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and put it into the chat box, and somebody will get back to you within 2 to 3 business days. And thanks again, everybody, for joining this episode of the Family Matters series. And we hope to see you again for our next episode in December, entitled "You Notice Your Loved One with Dementia is Demonstrating New Behaviors, such as agitation, anger, and more confusion at night. What causes this, and how can caregivers handle these difficult moments?" I'll leave the meeting up for a couple more minutes just in case anybody thinks of any questions. And otherwise, I hope you all have a great night.